Next are trumpets. Trumpets, where you buzz your lips. So if you take your finger and you put it in a circle and you buzz your lips through it, then you create the vibration needed for a trumpet. Trumpets come in all shapes and sizes. We have what are referred to as natural horns. So if you see the picture on the screen, that's an Australian didgeridoo. That could be considered a natural horn because it's valveless, and it actually comes from nature. That's a branch from the eucalyptus tree. So it could be considered a natural horn, but typically our natural horns are like our conch shells. So you go to the seashore, you pick up a seashell and you blow through it, you buzz your lips through it, and that becomes a natural horn. But typically brass players like to call any horn that has no valve or no key, valve, or slide a natural horn. So this is a valveless tubular horn. I believe it's from either Nepal or Tibet. It's a Buddhist ritual horn. And it has a mouthpiece, and I won't demonstrate because I'm not a brass player. But it has it's a drone instrument. So it's used in Mahayana Tibetan Buddhist ritual, where they just need long sustained guttural chants and long sustained drones. So that's what this instrument is for. A variant of that would be a bugle, where a natural horn bugle would be like you see in the old cavalry pictures, where it's just a single tube, much like the Tibetan instrument, where there's no valves. But this, you can see there is a piston and there's actually a rotor. So if it were played correctly, it'd be played with two hands. This is a soprano military bugle. It's in the key of G, as opposed to, say, a standard Western trumpet, which is in the key of B flat. This is an outdoor instrument. G, the size of the conical bearing, or the bore, allows it to be a louder instrument, so it's an outdoor instrument. And this is the earliest style of bugle with a valve and a rotor. That would be supplanted by this technology. This is the same, basically the same instrument, but instead you have the two valves up here. If you go watch the Commandant's Own, the Marine Drum and Bugle Corps, this will be the style of bugle that they use. It's in the key of G, it's an outdoor instrument, it's a very loud instrument when played properly. But this is the standard valve that you see on most bugles nowadays. And of course, you can have slides, you can have keys, all sorts of variances of that. And of course, you can further subdivide these between those that have mouthpieces and those that do not. Next are chordophones. Chordophones are really easy. Any instrument that has a string is a chordophone. And we separate these into two categories. First, your lute. Your lute is any chordophone that has a body and a neck. So you see the picture here, and it's standing up. You would, the face of the instrument, which is where you would pluck it, is what's considered the body of the instrument, and then the neck is the fingerboard. And now the separation of lutes is between fretted lutes and fretless lutes. So the fret, I don't have a lute in front of me, but a fret is the little marker on the fingerboard. If you think of an acoustic guitar, or a banjo, or a mandolin, or a sitar, or in the Chinese, the pipa, they carve the frets into the fingerboard. Frets are just, they're just reminders where you place your fingers. And it fixes the tuning system towards on the instrument. And then you have like a violin or a viola, or the Indian tambura, or the Chinese, the two-string fiddle, the erhu. Those are fretless instruments. You have no idea, you have to learn where to place your fingers, and the muscle memory is harder, but the tuning system is not fixed. So it gives you more freedom to play the instrument once you learn it. Now you can subdivide these accordingly as bowed, fretted bowed lutes, fretless bowed lutes, fretted plucked lutes, fretless plucked lutes. So there's all sorts of ways to further subdivide the lute family. Next are zithers. Zithers are chordophones with no neck. It's just a body. And this is where your piano would exist. Your piano would be considered a board zither, where all of the strings are stretched across a large board, which you see at the bottom of the string, the bottom of the screen there. with the Chinese, the guzheng, or the Japanese koto, or the Korean kayagum. That's that traditional plank that you see. Also your dulcimers. So the picture there to the left, the hammer dulcimer that you see there, is the Persian santur. This is the original instrument. It originates from Persia, and then it will travel across the Silk Road and end up in places like China and become the yangqin. It'll actually then, from Persia, go through Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, from Turkey into Europe, and become the cimbalum of Hungary, and then become the hammer dulcimer of England. So there's a lot of variations on this instrument. So that's your board zithers, what you see presented there. A common instrument in Africa is the musical bow. So like a bow and arrow, if you know that instrument, that the idea of taking a stick and attaching a string at both ends and allowing it to bend, that's not a neck. That's different. That's an entire body. So that's a separation. So the musical bow, don't get confused with the lute. That sort of instrument is what's called a string zither. And lastly, we have what are called yoke zithers, or your crossbar zither, and that's your harp or your lyre. And the only difference between a harp and a lyre is that when you play a harp, the strings go outward from you and they're attached across the crossbar this way, and a lyre is placed this way, and then the strings are attached accordingly. Lastly, or the next category are idiophones. Idio itself means self. So what we talk about with idiophones are instruments where the entire body of the instrument vibrates. This is a very complicated category, or a complicated category of instruments, because there are actually 7 subdivisions of idiophones. And so let me go through these really quickly. And if you want, I can, when it's all said and done between myself and Wang Mingzhe, if you want to see, if you have any additional questions, you want to see some videos, or if you have any questions about instruments, I can clarify it at this point. But for the sake of time, let me just quickly go through some of these categories. We have percussive idiophones. So if you can see the marimba next to me, so it's a percussive act. You take a stick, and the entire body of the wood vibrates to produce sound. So that's a percussive idiophone. Other great examples are like the Chinese gong, the Trinidad steel drum is another great example of a percussive idiophone. Next is concussive. Concussive. So let's clear up the distinction between percussive and concussive. Percussive means you take a stick or an object and you hit something else. Concussive means you have 2 objects that come together and hit. So theoretically, if you clap in a rhythmic fashion, your hands become concussive idiophones. Another common concussive idiophone are the finger cymbals. So it's a concussive act where the 2 objects then produce sound. All right, next on the list is the stamped idiophone. This is incredibly rare, and the only one I can think of, and I don't have one to demonstrate, it's what's referred to as the jingling Johnny. The Ottoman Empire, what becomes Turkey, the old Turkish Ottoman Empire used to have military bands where they'd have, this is where the bass drum originates from as well. So you'd have the bass drum ensemble. So you have Turkish military bands, and as they would march, they'd take these large poles and they would adorn them with bells, and they would stamp them against the ground. So that act, so if you ever hear Turkish military music, where it's bass drum and cymbal, well, that's to reenact the jingling Johnny, the stamped idiophone. Next is a scraped idiophone, and these are actually really fun. The real common one that you find is the old wooden frog, where you scrape the back of the wooden frog and it creates sound. The more common version is the Latin wiro. So the wiro, which is presented there, is probably the most common of the scraped idiophones. Next is a plucked idiophone. Plucked idiophones are called lamellophones. Lamella or lamel means tongue. So it has a tongue. So if you look at the picture next to you, next to the descriptions here, that is the African instrument called the mbira zavadzimu. So the Mbira Dzavadzimu has 22 tongues, and it's played with three, I think the index finger and two thumbs, and it's a polyrhythmic melodic instrument. And you pluck the little tongues to get sound. A music box is the same way. The example that I have, it's what's referred to as a mouth harp. Now, I don't know if you could hear this. I don't know if you can hear this at all. But that is what's called a mouth harp, where it utilizes the cavity of the mouth to project the sound, but also change the pitch. So that's a mouth harp. That's a plucked idiophone or a lamellophone. And lastly is a friction idiophone. And the best one, I guess, I would wonder if you would call that a friction idiophone. This is more than likely a shaker or a shaken idiophone. I think I skipped that category. So the shaken idiophone would be like a gourd rattle. But lastly on the list is the friction idiophone. So if you're familiar with a musical saw or a glass harmonica or a glass harp, so if you've ever taken a glass of water and you lick your finger and you rub the edge and it produces a sound, that friction of rubbing the edge of the glass causes that glass to become a friction idiophone. So that's the best example. And if we have time at the end of all of it, I'll show you a really good video of a friction idiophone. Lastly is the membranophone. Membranophone means skin or membrane. And this one actually can be divided into three distinct categories. Now, not all, there used to be this saying that all drums were membranophones, and that's really not true because you have steel drums that are idiophones. So I don't want to create the idea that all drums are membranophones. The majority of membranophones are drums, and they vary in shapes and sizes and playing techniques. But if you see, let's see, if you can see the timbale has a membrane that you would hit with a stick, so it's a percussive idiophone. Another common idiophone is the tambourine. So there's your skin, and it's actually percussive because you hit it with your hand. And we'll talk about the bells in a minute, but this is primarily a membranophone. The friction membranophone is incredibly rare. On the bottom, you have two pictures. To the left, you have the tambourine or the frame drum, and to the right, you have what's referred to as a cuica. And I show you that cuica because if you look at the back end, if you look at the inside of the cuica, you see that there's a stick that is shoved through the skin. And what the player will do is they'll lick their finger, or they'll put talcum powder or some sort of rosin on their finger, and they'll rub that stick, and it causes the membrane to vibrate. It's a cuica. It's a Brazilian instrument. It's the only real application is in Brazilian samba music. Lastly is the singing membrane, and this is the most famous of all, is the kazoo, where you sing through it and it causes the tissue paper to vibrate, thus creating sound. And this is where we can argue that we talk about the human voice being different from instruments, but arguably the human voice has two vocal cords. They're called vocal cords, but I don't know if they're actual strings or vocal cords or skins. So if we could prove that vocal cords were membranes, then singing in and of itself is a singing membranophone. So the voice itself could be an instrument beyond, in terms of classifying it within this system. Couple of last things to talk about before I pass the floor over to my clarinet predecessor here. We've got sympathetic devices, which are secondary vibrations. And I talked about the tambourine a second ago. Secondary or sympathetic devices they're not rare, but they're also not very common. We find them on Indian string instruments. We find them on African idiophones primarily. And there are two basic kinds of sympathetic devices. We have sympathetic strings, where if you take a row of strings and put them on a lute, and then you put a secondary row of strings on top, when you pluck the top row of strings, it causes the bottom row of strings to vibrate. You never physically touch the bottom row of strings, so therefore they vibrate in sympathy. So that's the principle here. The sitar is probably the most famous of all sympathetic devices, the sympathetic strings. But really, I go back to the example of, I show you these two instruments here. Most people think, oh wow, those are both just tambourines, but these are two organologically different instruments. They're both primarily the same instruments, but think about it. You take this version of the tambourine, and to produce sound, you have to actually hit the frame, which makes this an idiophone. This is an idiophone where the primary vibration is the bell. This, on the other hand, is a membranophone, where the primary vibration is the membrane, but the secondary vibration is the bell. So while it may appear that these are, in fact, two tambourines, organologically, they're two separate instruments. Now, this is the Sachsen-Hornbostel system. You basically have all the categories here: aerophone, chordophone, idiophone, membranophone. You can basically take these principles and find instruments that you're not familiar with and figure out how to organologically categorize them. I will say that since the time of Kurt Sachsen and Erich von Hornbostel, we have had modifications to the system. And the most famous of these are by Margaret Kartomi, who I believe was an ethnomusicologist in Australia, Tur Ellingson, who is an ethnomusicologist at the University of Washington, and Roderick Knight, who I actually spent some time with his instrument collection at Oberlin, at the Oberlin Conservatory. He just recently, in the last 10 years or so, retired from Oberlin, but I saw him give a speech for the Society of Ethnomusicology on the topic of organology, and I went and spent a whole day with him at Oberlin, and he walked me through his instrument collection, and it was fabulous. And between the three of these ethnomusicologists, they've really done a lot to really include a lot of the new instruments that have come onto the scene since the old acoustic instruments. And what we've really seen is a fifth category, and that's what's called electrophones. And these are all instruments that are connected to electricity. So, and they're subdivided into three categories. We have electrically actuated acoustic instruments like a Hammond B3 organ. We have electrically amplified acoustic instruments like the acoustic guitar, or if you take a violin and you put pickups on it so it becomes an electric violin, that would become an electrophone. And then lastly, we have electrically driven oscillators, and there's where we get our theremin. The theremin, which was the instrument that got us into this discussion. So there we have it. This is the basic standard organological system. And again, if you have any questions, I'll be more than willing to answer questions, but I really want to make sure that Wang Mingzhou gets his fair share of time to speak. So I will now pass the floor over to him. So I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak. I hope I didn't go too long for everybody.